Welcome to the walkthrough of assignment 1A in my CS8395 class in the spring of 2024. First and foremost, please document your code thoroughly as described at this link. Code that isn't properly documented will not be reviewed henceforth. Secondly, please don't remove the to-do tags from the code, which makes it harder for me to review. Submissions that lack to-do tags will not be reviewed, so make sure you have the to-do tags in the code. Third, let's take a look at one of the problems with a method in the proxy file on the client side. First, don't format your code to run off the right side of the screen. Instead, this code should be formatted like this, where you have basically new lines for each of the different methods that are in this Fluent interface. And number two, you want to make sure that you comment each of those methods according to the way that I do in my examples. So take a look at the examples that we walk through, such as the bearer quotes case study app we did the other day, and make sure you follow the same conventions. Also, there's no need to use the from HTTP URL method since the URL is actually set by the get rest template bean defined in components.java on the server side. And then finally, don't hard code the host name, but instead use the provided string constants. Or if there aren't string constants provided, define your own. In this case, there is a string constant defined for the host. Moving on, here's another issue here. Make sure you use the appropriate string constant once again. Also, make sure to use the appropriate string constant here. You don't want to be hard coding these as string literals. That will come back to bite you when you start making changes because you'll quickly get inconsistencies between your client and your server code. And also make sure you call .build before you call toURIString. Moving on to yet another issue with search movies. This is another method that's defined in the proxy file on the client side. Something important is missing here. You need to make sure that you have the right separator between get, search, and query. Otherwise, the URL will be munged together. And also don't use query param here, but instead you need to append this query to the end of get search, as we did in the bearer quotes case study example, and as it sort of does here, but you have to make sure you put the right separator between the get search and the query. Whenever you have questions about how to do this, take a look at the bearer quotes case study that we walk through in great detail, and you'll see a lot of hints there that'll help you. Moving on to another method, this is search movies, that takes a list of strings. Something important is missing here. You're not actually putting the name queries in there. Down here, this is done in a more correct way, except please make sure that you use a string constant for queries, which in this case you need to define in the constants.java file, rather than using a hard-coded string literal. Just good habit to get into. Down here, this is, now we're on the server side and we're taking a look at the components.java file. The implementation of this method is very incomplete. You need to put all the logic for essentially creating a list of movies and all the other things you've got to do to make that list. This is not sufficient. Let's now take a look at another implementation of the movie list factor method in the components.java file that has some issues here. First, please make sure that you replace this object-oriented Java code using Java functional programming and sequential streams. So you don't want to be allocating a new hash map by itself. And more particularly, you don't want to be doing something like this where you say new array list. Instead, you want to be using Java streams. And you don't want to be using a Java for each loop as done here. Instead, you want to be using a Java stream. So please fix all of these issues to use the appropriate Java streams functional programming approach rather than using the object-oriented approach. Down here, yet another issue. This approach of the implementation of movie list does in fact use the streams mechanism, except make sure you use toList here instead of collect toList. toList was added in Java 16 and just makes things a bit more concise. Let's start taking a look here where we're going to be doing the controller implementation. You don't need to have the leading slash. That's superfluous. It's redundant. So if you get rid of that, then you can clean this code up quite a bit by just doing something like this, which is more concise. Next, please make sure that you also just return list movie instead of returning response entity to a list of movie. Down here, some other issues. Don't use request mapping. Instead, you want to use get mapping. Don't use hard-coded string literals here, but instead use the appropriate string constant. And also there's something else that's important that's missing here. This won't work properly. And so you need to make sure you add the part that's going to actually be the query parameter. And down here, the wrong annotation is being used. Once again, please take a close look at the bearer quotes case study. I show something almost identical to what you need to do and follow the same pattern. Down here, don't return response entity to a list of objects, just return a list of movie. That's one of the great things about Spring WebMVC. You can write code that looks pretty much like good old Java code. And down here, this is way too complicated. All you need to do is just say return service get movies, and that will go ahead and call the service implementation, get the results, and then return it as a list of movies. So you don't need to do all this extra stuff here. Down here, the wrong name is being passed here to request param. This is the implementation of search movies in the controller that takes a list of string queries. You're passing in the wrong name, so that won't match up with what you're doing on your client side. So make sure you fix that. Now, down here, we're in the service file, and this code isn't correct because it's not using auto-wired. So make sure you use auto-wired. There's no need to have this movie data map at all. That's unnecessary. Moreover, please get rid of this movie services constructor. This is completely unnecessary if you use auto-wired correctly up here. As always, just go back and take a look at the bearer quotes case study to see how to do all this properly. It lays it all out for you. There's no need to have this implementation here. This is not where it belongs. This method also doesn't belong here. This should disappear. And the behavior that's here should be moved into the components.java file. Of course, down here, you should get rid of this code here, collect to collectors.toList, and just use toList. That'll clean things up quite a bit. And then finally, in the implementation of the search method, don't create a local variable. Just return the results of calling the stream and the various intermediate operations directly. And that will be much more effective than what you're doing here. So there's no need to have an extra local variable that you return. That just makes your code a little harder to read. So that's the walkthrough of the frequently made mistakes that I saw when I reviewed the submissions that have come in correctly and on time for CS 395.